Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we want to look at Jeremiah, uh, a young man with a vision, a mission, and a set of values. He also, primary to that, fundamental to all of that, he had a call. He had a call from God. And Jeremiah, I don't know what you think of Jeremiah when you think of him, but he was a young man. He was a teenage prophet, actually. I've read somewhere that he was about 17, but certainly not more than 20. The word that is used for him is not normally used for young adults over the age of 20. So he was a teenager, and he served as a prophet for about 55 years, maybe a little more. He served under three Judean kings. This is at the end of a long process. As we should all remember, the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, went bad faster. It went into idolatry and went off into captivity about 125 years before the kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom. It went about 125 years earlier. The northern kingdom, though, also suffered from serious spiritual decay, and Jeremiah served under three Judean kings: Josiah, who was a righteous king. He was not perfect, but he was a giant. He was great, and he served a long time. But he was the last great hope of the Judea. Then there was Jehoiakim, his son, and another son, Zedekiah, Tzidkiyahu. Jehoiakim was, shall I say, he was inconsistent. He was vacillating. He was a weak king. And then Zedekiah was installed by the king of Babylon as a vassal flunky, as a puppet king, and he only served for a few months before being taken off into Babylon with the rest of the people into the Babylonian captivity. And before that happened, his sons were slain before his eyes. I cannot imagine the horror of watching your own children being killed in front of your eyes, and then his eyes were gouged out. This is not a pretty picture. And he was taken off as a pet, as a trophy to Babylon, as a real sign of the superior power of Babylon. So Israel and Judah were surrounded by three pagan superpowers. Egypt was perhaps the most benign, if I could use that word. Assyria was the Nazis of the day. They were very barbaric. And Babylon, as you just heard, was not better. And that was the time in which Jeremiah lived and prophesied. And he was a man with a vision, a mission, and a set of values. His vision is what he sought to accomplish. He sought to address all the kings to whom God sent him and to say what he had to say. So he spoke to the kings of Judah, but he also spoke to Pharaoh. He also spoke to the rulers of Assyria. He spoke to Babylonian rulers. His mission was to build up and also to tear down, to build up and to tear down, to uproot and to destroy. And his values were who he was going to be in the process. He was going to be an obedient servant to God. God said, don't break down before them. He warns him. He's a teenager. Jeremiah says, like Moses, he says, don't send me, please. And God says, look, don't you break down before them or I'll break you down before them. God dealt with him rather sternly, but it was the sternness of a invincible father who made Jeremiah into the great one of the great giants of Jewish life. So he had a vision, something he wanted to get done, a mission, things that he wanted to do in order to get those things done, and he had values. And we're going to be looking at that a little bit more. So here it is again. I'm talking to Shuva Yisrael in New York about this because I inherited this congregation. It's a very good congregation, but to my surprise, they didn't have a mission statement, a value statement, or a vision statement. And we need, all of us in our religious associations, we need a sense of vision, a sense of mission, vision, what we're trying to, the change we're trying to make in the world. Mission is the things we feel called to do towards that change. And values, the kind of people we're going to be in the process. We need these things to better serve God. And they're not something that's supposed to exist in our documents, but in our hearts, our minds, our words, and our deeds. You know, many times congregations have mission statements and vision statements, and you ask the people of the congregation, what's the mission of this congregation? And they don't know. Now, I'm not here to throw stones at anybody, but it's vision statements and mission statements and value statements are meant to really inhabit the people. They're not just meant to be on the documents. It's a big mistake. It's a mistake that many congregations make. People don't know their vision statement, their mission statement, their value statement. They don't know what they don't really know what they're trying to do. They have cliches. Messianic congregations have cliches, what to try to do. Well, we want to teach our children the Jewish way of life. That's true. We want to pass it on to the next generation and appropriate from the previous generation. That's also true. We want to bring Jewish people to Yeshua. That's also true. They're all very nice, but it's very white bread, because what does God uniquely call your congregation to be? Ahavat Zion has evolved into an excellent prayer fellowship. It seems to be something God has called us to be. And you need to know what your group uniquely is called to be, not simply pious platitudes, predictable truisms, and certainly not simply ornate statements that appear in the documents, but nobody knows what they are. So let me back up a bit here. So Jeremiah had a vision, what he sought to accomplish. He had a mission, the actions he was prepared to undertake in terms of accomplishing those things, and he had values, who he was prepared to be. Now, another mistake that I think that congregations and associations of believers make in our day sometimes is we appropriate a business model. What we want to do is we want to grow as a congregation. We want to make budget. For many congregations, it would seem as though the not consciously, but subconsciously, the goal of the congregation is to fill the seats and make the budget. Well, that's pretty pathetic. We can't and we shouldn't make our vision statements, mission statements, and value statements by ourselves, by looking at the business world, by looking at other congregations. We need to look to God. And God does enter into this process with Jeremiah in terms of helping him to have a sense of vision, a sense of mission, and a sense of values. God does five things, and I want to look at these five things. First of all, Jeremiah knew that he was addressed by God. He knew that God was, in our passage, it says, the word of the Lord came to me 3 times. And the word of the Lord comes to us too. We may not hear a voice, and we're not likely to hear a voice, but yet there are times when we sense that, when a community senses that God is addressing that community in some way, there's a sense of common momentum in a certain way that is a holy momentum. So first, in order for us to develop a sense of vision and mission and values, we prayerfully look to God and look for times when we sense as a community that God seems to be indicating something, that we're being addressed by God. Secondly, Jeremiah knew himself to be shaped by God for a purpose. Adonai says to him, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and I ordained you a prophet to the nations." So God is telling him, I've shaped you for something. That's fantastic stuff. Each of you, each of us, he's shaped us for something in our lives. He shapes congregations for something. He shapes us for a purpose. This gives us a certain amount of orientation, not just confidence, but a certain orientation to what we're looking for when we try to articulate our vision, our mission, our values. We look to see, what has God shaped us for? What has God shaped me for? As I look back over my life, what are my natural abilities? What are my acquired skills? What are my spiritual gifts? What is, for Ahavat Zion, what's the history of this congregation? What has been the tenor of its teaching over the years? How has it evolved? What seems to work for us? In other words, we don't start forming a vision and a mission and values. We don't start from zero. We start from, what has God been doing? How has God been shaping us? So first, we're addressed by God. We sense ourselves being addressed by God. Secondly, we know ourselves to be shaped by God for a purpose. We also need to take comfort and be instructed by the fact that God knows us. He knows our frame. He knows that we're dust. He knows us cold. God said, yes, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I knew you. God knows everything about us. So we look to him in times of transition, in times of formation, in times of vision, in times of mission, in times of values. We recognize that God has shaped us for something, and he knows us exactly as we are. God also anoints us and appoints us. That's what he did with Jeremiah. Adonai put out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, "There, I've put my words in your mouth." God touches Jeremiah to equip him for a purpose. He anoints and appoints. This is great stuff. Not because I'm saying it, but because life experience demonstrates this is what gives us excitement. It's not simply what we do for God. It's what God does with us. He anoints us and he appoints us. He gives us enhanced abilities, and he gives us a capacity for influence, anointing and appointing. And finally, in Jeremiah's experience, God arrests him, as in the words, meaning he stops him. He says, "Don't say I'm only a youth," because that's what Jeremiah is in the business of doing. He's in the business of saying, I'm not qualified. I'm a nobody. I'm only a youth. Moses also says, "I'm a man of unclean lips." No, I'm sorry, that's Isaiah. Moses says, "I don't know how to speak. Send somebody else." But God arrests him. And I would say to each of us in our lives, and to us as a group, to Ahavat Zion in terms of looking at its future, and whatever future you find in whatever group you find yourself in, God would say to us, there are certain things I don't want you to say. I don't want you to cut yourself off at the legs by discouraging yourself, by saying, "Oh, I'm only this and I'm not that." God doesn't want us to do that. So with Shuva Yisrael, here's an example of a vision statement, of a values statement I am working on. for them. And this value statement is based on who they already are. It's not merely an ambition of what I think the congregation ought to be when it grows up, but this is what God has shaped it to be in the perhaps 50 years of its history, 34 years under my predecessor. You see what's in the air. You see what has God been doing with this congregation. How has he anointed them? How has he appointed them? And this is what I came up with. Well, I visited this congregation about 5.5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. My son Chaim and my daughter-in-law Miriam, when I was visiting in New York, they took me there because they had been visiting there, and I'd never been there before. And what struck me about the congregation was it was very strong relationally. And I wrote a letter to the rabbi and his wife after that visit, and I commended them for their congregation, for the congregation's relational strength. And the rabbi wept because he really was always hungry for affirmation, and nobody ever written him a letter about his ministry. At that point, he'd been there about 30 years. When he left, he was there 34 years. I never knew that I was going to be coming back to that congregation as its rabbi. But as I've been working with the elders on the value statement, I've taken into consideration who they already are, because that's part of who they're going to be. Who Avatzion already is part of who it's going to be. So this is the statement, and I want to discuss it with you a little bit. Shuva Yisrael Messianic Synagogue practices relational Messianic Judaism, loving Adonai our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. One more. We are a great congregation, G-R-E-A-T, guided by the scriptures, responsive to the Ruach, engaged with Jewish community concerns, advocating Yeshua our Messiah, tradition, sorry, couldn't see the bottom word there. Tradition honoring, yes, there it is. So, guided by the Spirit, and let's back up and look at it again. Okay, thank you very much. Shuva Yisrael Messianic Synagogue practices relational Messianic Judaism, loving Adonai our God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. We are a great congregation guided by the scriptures, responsive to the Ruach, engaged with the Jewish community concerns, advocating Yeshua our Messiah, tradition honoring. Okay, now, I want to look at that, ask some questions. Why, what do you notice in terms of use? What do you notice about this statement? Anything stand out? Okay, I may be being too arcane. It's meant to be easily remembered. The first statement is we're a relational Messianic Jews congregation, and then you just think of the first two commandments, loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and our neighbor as ourselves. You want to do a statement, in this case a value statement, which is easy to remember. You just think of the first two commandments. Somebody asks you, tell me about your congregation. And you tell them, well, we're a relational Messianic congregation. We believe in loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and our neighbor as ourselves. I'm going to show this to these people later tonight. They haven't seen it yet. But once you see that, and once you have that explanation, then you remember it. And that's why I did that acronym of GREAT, G-R-E-A-T. The reason I did that is because, well, we don't want to do that. The reason I did that, the GREAT acronym, is because it's also easy to remember. Let me get that thing up again. There it is. we're a great congregation, and I think these are 5 things that do characterize the congregation, that characterize the things that ring its chimes, which I think are things that God has planted in this congregation over the years. A zeal for the scripture. The congregation was made up of the joining of 3 congregations, one of whom which was Pentecostal, two that were not. So we want to give due attention to the Ruach. So they're very scripturally oriented, they very strong teaching, guided by the Ruach, engaged with the Jewish community concerns. This is a very big thing for them, advocating Yeshua as Messiah, and honoring tradition honoring. So I wanted to share that with you. I hope it was instructive for you, for arrangements you make yourselves as the days go by.